suggestion of our presenter today. Thank you. Okay, 1 minute warning, 1 minute warning. Thank you for coming today. Please take a seat. Thank you. I'd like to begin. We've had worship this morning, and some of us have just come out of the service. But nonetheless, this congregational meeting, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. We pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you are the head of the church in every age, and your people gather to worship you in spirit and in truth. As we begin what may be perhaps a new adventure for our congregation, we pray that your hand of blessing rests upon the work that we do, not just in our name, but especially in your name, that the gospel may continue to be spread in this part of your world. We ask it humbly in your name and know that you hear us. Amen. Okay, I won't presume everybody knows me, and why am I standing up here? My name is Keith Wessel. I'm a son of this congregation. I was baptized in the church basement before there was a congregational, before this was built, a superstructure. Then my sister Grace was baptized up at college while this was being built, and then finally, our baby sister Claire was baptized here in 1968 when the superstructure was completed. That doesn't qualify me really for anything, except I'm very familiar with St. John's, right? Now 56 years old. I was baptized on July 4th. I even know that too, in 1965. But for our purposes here today, about 2 years ago, I think a little over 2 years ago, our congregational president, Steve Thiedsfeld, asked if I'd be willing to put together a group that would specifically look at our congregational facilities. And so the CFTF was born, the Congregational Facilities Task Force, okay? And we were specifically charged with looking at the future needs of St. John's. And then COVID hit, and then everything was weird. All right, but I would like to introduce the members of our committee if they're all here today. I saw Karen. Where is Karen Grunwald? Okay, Karen, just waving a hand. We're very thankful to have Karen on our committee because she also served on the building project. And Earl Heidke was the chairman of that. He's here today too. He's been a good resource for us as well when we've met. Also on our committee is Ron Zart, whom I don't see here today, but Ron, Jesse's shaking his head. His father, Ron, moved here a few years ago from Texas, where he was a licensed architect. He has made it clear he does not have a Minnesota license and cannot design our present building, or if we decide to build something, he cannot design that. Also on our committee are two members of the trustees, the ones responsible for the physical plant, Scott Dieters, see here, and Kurt Karstens. And then we also have on our committee John Mitchell. John, just wave your hand. John is kind of the finance side of everything. He helps keep the dreamers in line. And then we have pastors. Well, I admit, I'm in that camp. I'm a dreamer, right. And then our pastors and also our staff minister, Jim Dretsky. They are currently serving on the Congregational Facilities Task Force. This is not a permanent group of the congregation. It's meant to be a short-term, we have a short-term commission. All right. Now, we met a few times, and one of the things that we asked to do is, oh, here comes Ron. Good, yeah. I already introduced you, Ron. Yeah. But one of the things that came out of that, you may remember about a year and a half ago, we took a congregational poll via Google Forms, and we actually got quite a good response back from that from the congregation. One of the things we were asking was for a little bit of direction. Well, it was a congregational survey, but the council gave us about 4 or 5 questions about the facilities. One of the things that came out of that is, what should we do? We need more Sunday school space, fellowship hall. We only built about half of the original plan from the back in the early 2000s. Should we complete that? We have the 75th anniversary of the congregation coming up. Shall we spend some time renovating the 55-year-old interior of the sanctuary? What should we do? Well, the congregation respondents gave some indication to us, and that's what kind of brings us here today. There was, at that time, a very clear indication that of the projects that we could possibly do for the future, many would like to see us tackle a sanctuary renovation, okay? There are certainly things with carpet and padding on the pews and wiping down now COVID. A lot of the varnish is disappearing from the pews, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't really know where to begin. It was kind of like trying to figure out how to stuff an octopus into a plastic bag. And so we decided to engage some professional help. And that brings Mr. Paul Barabo from Growth Design of Cedarburg, Wisconsin, just north of Mequon and the seminary here today. We have not contracted with Growth to do anything except today. And what today is called an envisioning meeting. It is specifically designed to listen to the congregation. That's what its purpose is. So nothing has been planned. There are no projects designed. This is really just the starting point. And so the purpose is for you, really. We had a meeting with Paul this summer via Zoom, and it was a very compelling idea that, we get together first for this congregational envisioning meeting, because this cannot be, of course, the project of one small committee. It has to be a congregational project. All right, now, there will be time for questions and answers. I encourage you, if your question, it'll be limited, but if you have questions, please write them down on a piece of paper and hand them to me or one of our committee members. Karen's going to be taking some notes. I'm going to be taking some notes. We are live streaming this. Those of you who are joining us via live stream on Facebook, feel free to write your questions there. Pastor Gunther will be monitoring that on his phone. And then this also is being recorded, and it will be archived. So if there's something that you saw and what was that? And it went by a little bit too quickly, Just know that we are making a recording of that, and that will be available on our regular YouTube channel. With that, I introduce to you Mr. Paul Barabo of Growth Design for our congregational envisioning meeting. Thank you. You don't have to clap. For me, but maybe for you.
Keeping track of time. I'm a former pastor, and I always tell my clients it is very dangerous giving a former pastor a microphone. So I want to be respectful for our time together. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Keith and his committee to invite our firm to come and help with at least uncovering some of the things that you hope for. I want to correct a little bit. If there is a perception that you will be asking questions, you certainly can do that. However, part of what we'll do in the second part of this visioning workshop is really not so much asking questions, but sharing your perspective on where there are challenges and opportunities to bring the full proclamation of gospel and sacrament to flourish in this space. The agenda for this morning is very, very simple. We already have been through prayer and introduction. We also, as the first part of this, I'll be presenting to you what other churches have done, what things they have wrestled with, and how they have found solutions to those things that help bring the celebration of worship and proclamation of the gospel and sacrament into current times. One of the things that is always a challenge for churches is while you are a part of a larger synod, all churches move in little different waves of growth and development. And as your members move from church to church, if they change jobs or move to a place of retirement, it's nice when the church as a whole provides things that are constant or familiar across a larger synod. So that somebody that gets used to, for instance, great places for parenting and moves to another church that maybe doesn't have great places for parenting, feel at home. So that's part of the reason that we want to make sure all congregations think about renewal and continually renewing their facility. Your church is not that old. It is old, but it is not that old. But what I'm always amazed with is how much churches actually do change over the course of the years. When I work with churches, they often say, well, everything has always been this way. And then I look back at photos and find out that that's actually not true. But that incremental change of renewal over the years is less noticeable until you look back to see where you started. The second part of this will be a discussion amongst you that I will help facilitate about what you love here, what opportunities you have here, what things challenge your congregation for worship, and what dreams you may have when we start looking at how to bring sacrament and gospel to its fullest expression here in this place. And then we'll have an ending with closing in prayer. I want to start. It's been some years since I was a pastor, but I do remember being able to question confirmands as a part of that role. I want to start with a question to you on what forms the biblical writers used in order to understand the form of spirit. And I'm going to give you a hint, because every once in a while when I do this, somebody says, dove. And actually, the biblical writers talk about spirit being like a dove, but the biblical writers relay to us that the Spirit of God has two forms. Comes to us in two forms. Does anybody know what those are? So, fire, right? Spirit comes in tongues of fire, and Spirit also comes in wind or breath. Those are the two forms that are witnessed in the gospel message and in the Acts of the Apostles. What I find fascinating about that as a church architect is that it essentially says that the Spirit is free form. There is no form to fire. It goes where it wills. There is no form for wind. It goes where it wills. And if in fact you try to enclose fire, what happens? It goes out. It stops being fire. And if you enclose wind, stops being wind. The biblical writers understood that spirit cannot be limited by form. And this poses a great challenge to a church architect who has to provide an enclosure for a congregation of the Spirit. It reminds us that, in fact, while we have to shelter buildings, our congregation and our ministries, those enclosures cannot stop the Spirit from doing what Spirit needs to do. They enable, they help, they assist, but it is not about the building. It is about the Spirit of God in the building, moved through the building. And the building needs to change over time to accommodate where the Spirit leads the congregation. The church also uses, as a part of its liturgy, other things that flow. Water, fire, spirit or air, the sustenance of the earth, that is, the things that grow out of the earth and sustain us. These four elements at one time, earth, air, fire, and water, were believed in ancient times to have been those things that form the cosmos. And the church has adopted those as a part of our celebration of gospel and sacrament. And I'm going to use those four symbols as a way to order what I present to you. Fire, water, air, and the sustenance that grows from the earth. Now, the biblical writers were, of course, in the Middle East. Had they been in the Midwest of the United States, they may have added a fifth. But I'll use these four. The first one is fire. It talks about the calling of the church, the presence of the church, our commonality together and the remembrance of things past. The most common symbol of that for many congregations is the Easter Vigil. I don't know if your congregation here does an Easter Vigil, but it is the light that comes out of darkness during the celebration of Holy Week. It is often displayed in candlelight services, which are harder and harder to do by fire code. But it is that sense of beacon that calls. As we look at a church building and its presence, we have to think about how the church calls people to worship. It isn't as if worship starts when you pass through the doors at the end of this aisle. It starts when people leave home and drive here and approach the church and park and walk to the building. How that building expresses itself on the outside prepares people for how they come to worship when they do arrive at these doors, and how that works not only at day and in the night, how the church is a beacon, calling people to come worship. The presence of light in the church building is incredibly important to architecture and art. Architecture and art thrive with light. This is a church, very typical kind of church built in the 60s, long and narrow, kind of the new cathedral style, very, very high, like an old cathedral. At that time, as you can see from this photo, they put a lot of light in the front, and the congregation, while it had some beautiful stained glass, had very little light. I talked to this congregation, and they were well aware of this church being much like a theater where people watch what's going on in the front, but do not have active participation because they feel like they're in a theater. And the renovation of that space actually brought the people who lived in darkness into the light. In fact, we had somebody at the dedication that came into the church and said, "How did you clean the ceiling?" And I said, "We didn't clean the ceiling, we just put light on it." You can't see the ceiling in that church before we brought light to the congregation and helped them to be able to understand that what happens in the front, in the light of the front, is really a part of what happens to the light in the pews. We are all worshiping together. We are not observing what happens. An older example of this is your sister church in Libertyville, Illinois, St. John's Lutheran in Libertyville. New lighting in the worship space, new materials in the front. You can see here, very difficult to pull out their sacred symbols out of that space because the lighting was not focused and the materials did not accentuate their beautiful carved stone altar and the pulpit and lectern and font. This is a church in Madison, Wisconsin. A beautiful old 1950s building. They had a fire in the worship in 1970. They decided, since their church was very dark, the way they would lighten the church after the fire, because the deck was burned and could not be restored, so they painted everything white and put in fluorescent lights. Not a good move. But it was the 70s. We can forgive a lot of the sins of the 70s. Their renovation not only turned the worship to bring everybody closer, but it also imagined how light and color could be brought back into that space and give it the passion that worship needs. This is actually a church in Marquette that reminds me a lot of your building. When I walked in, it was like going back to Marquette, Michigan, because this church is long and narrow, has side areas, brick in the back instead of stone. And their big challenge wasn't so much the aesthetics of the space, the lighting of the space, but they noticed as we were talking about their building how all of the values in the front were all the same. The carpet was pretty much the same, the wood, the brick, everything, ceiling, everything was pretty much the same. And they needed to provide more focus and introduce technology into that space in order to be able to provide for a movement in the congregation toward more contemporary praise band service. That was their largest service, was a non-traditional service. And it is incredibly difficult introducing technology into church spaces. Light also plays a part in how, not only how we bring light into the worship space, but what it helps us focus in looking out. This is a church in Lorain, Ohio, that their church building burned. And when they rebuilt, they decided that they wanted to open up the congregation, the worship space, to the surrounding community because they had an incredibly vibrant outreach ministry. And so they built a portion of their church building with a corner missing. It was a way of inviting people into the building, proclaiming the presence of the building to the outside, and not only that, while they are in worship, they are reminded of why they are the people of God. It is to serve God, and to serve God by reaching out back into the world and giving the gifts that God had given them, taking that to other people. And what that looks like on the inside. So they are continually reminded here about their witness out to the world. Invitation and witness. The church gathers and sends. That's what the church does. And their building expresses that. Second symbol, water. The traditional symbol is, of course, very, very clear. Most sacramental denominations understand the importance of baptism as the sustenance, the birth into the community and the sustenance of the life of the Christian. And so fonts typically have a very present role. And more we're seeing fonts that provide for the visibility of the water and the presence of the water. The church I grew up in southern Wisconsin, had a font not unlike yours. Very rarely was water in the font. The font was typically covered, and occasionally it wasn't even in the worship. So the symbol is traditionally the font, but the expression of water can speak to us about how we reach out to people and bring them into the family of God. That can be for children and how they find a place in the church and in worship, how parents tend to children. I remember the first tour I took of a church, of an old church building. It was like a 1950s building, as an architect. And I had never been in a women's room that I recall, probably as an infant, but not as an adult. And I remember walking in and seeing this large area with couches. And I went, they have couches. The women of the church have couches. But in the 50s, we understood that you have to prepare for families to tend to children. And if you have places for mothers to nurse, the family can stay at church longer, engaging in the ministries of the church. So how parents, mothers and fathers, are able to tend to children is a vital part of ministry to families. And young families that get used to having the convenience of places that are private to nurse children, good opportunities to change diapers, programming that facilitates the children being engaged and the parents having an opportunity to have respite from having to parent, those families tend to come and stay. It's one of the reasons why the big box church, there are two things that the big box church does really well. Personally, I don't think it's theology, but that's just me. What they do really well is hospitality, and they provide for parents. And that brings people back. It's not to say that we shouldn't have the best theology and the best liturgical practice. We should. But part of what brings people back, particularly if they are unchurched, is how we allow them to be family. So what provisions we make in worship, but it is not just about children, parenting. It's also about all ages. There are people of all age who need custodial care. They may have physical limitations that make it difficult for them to navigate steps or aisles or find a way to understand their way through the church and engage with other people because of physical limitations. I am always aware that the code does not do a very good job in providing restrooms for women. We have something called, we call it potty parity. You have to have the right balance between men and women. Women's restrooms are woefully, usually, inadequate because it just takes longer to go through those restrooms. Having the right number of available resources for human comfort is also incredibly important for all ages and genders and ability. So it's not uncommon to see much larger restrooms than most of the churches built prior to 1990. I still see churches that were built in the 70s and the 80s that have like 2 little closets for men and women, and it doesn't allow us to stay at church longer. Single-use restrooms are becoming more and more common, and in fact, if you have a certain number of restrooms in the building, you actually now, by code, are required to have one. It allows for people that need more room, or need more privacy, or need assistance from a parent or a spouse to be able to do that with dignity. And part of what we are about as a church should be giving people dignity that life has maybe not been equitable toward. And of course, places then that families can use and have space to be able to tend to a child in a way that is comfortable and private. When we talk about invitation, it is about custodial care, not only for children, but for everybody, of every ability. Maybe not the dog. Now, I did a workshop about a year ago, right before COVID hit, and I said, maybe not the dog, making a joke. Interestingly enough, a woman in the back of the worship said, "What do you mean?" She had a seeing eye dog. So we have to think about the full range of needs of people as we design our buildings to give them dignity and to invite them to full fellowship in our congregations. Third symbol, the sustenance of the earth, that which grows out of the earth and provides nourishment and sustenance for God's people. The traditional symbol of that is, of course, the altar, where we celebrate the sustenance that God gives us through body and blood, using those elements that grow out of the earth. This is your sister congregation, Resurrection, in Verona, Wisconsin. And there are many symbols of altar over the years. I believe this is Grace in downtown Milwaukee, and Faith Evangelical Lutheran in Antioch. Yep. Two different, very, very different expressions of altar. Every church, depending on the era that they built the building, does altar differently. What is common to it is that the altar should be the central focus of our liturgy. It's not that word and baptism is not important, but everything leads up to our table of sacrifice. And I often joke, I come out of a Lutheran background, so I can joke with Lutherans. Lutherans were kind of notorious for creating beautiful wood altars and then providing wood wainscot around their chancel space so that you actually couldn't see the altar. It blended into the woodwork, literally blended into the woodwork. Part of what we often do with both lighting and color is getting the sacred symbols of the church to feel that they are central to everything else that happens, because they are. They are central to our faith. And how we arrange people around them and give them prominence and access is incredibly important. I can't tell you how many congregations I work with that can no longer climb stairs, but they still have communion rails that are at the top of at the top of 3 or 4 steps, and require people to fit in by kneeling. I don't have bad knees yet, but I do have the start of a bad hip, and I wonder how that would be convenient for me trying to participate and not be able to get full access. I was delighted to see that you do communion that is barrier-free here. But there are other tables, right? The altar isn't the only table that you have in your church. Most churches also have to think about how you do fellowship outside of the church. This is a brand new facility, but gathering spaces, you are gathered around altar here, but you also have fellowship after church. And in fact, studies show, doesn't matter how beautiful the worship is, what brings people back, is visitors back, is what happens with the interpersonal connection outside of worship. There is nothing more important than telling someone, we're happy to have you here, will you come back? The best way to do that is often surrounding food. Nothing draws people together more than food. The service of food, this is a gathering space in a church north of Milwaukee that previously had nothing more than the 12 by 12 church narthex that really was more about moving people from outside to inside than about gathering the church after worship and welcoming visitors and asking them to come back. This is a church that had a corner of the gathering space. They had a large gathering space, but no way to do the invitation of food to visitors and to each other. They had a little galley kitchen over here, and a corner here that the pastor said was a place where things go to die. Anything that nobody knew what to do with in the church ended up in this corner, and he said, we need to get rid of it, and we need to put in something that is more familiar to people in the way of hospitality. And so, so they created what is essentially a coffee and juice bar for the congregation. I don't know your sensibility here in New Ulm as much. Where I grew up in the early 60s, the paradigm for church fellowship was the VFW and the supper club. Great things for my generation. The younger generation are much more fluid. Starbucks, Barnes & Noble, Noodles. This is where they feel at home. If you want to attract young people and young families, you have to create an environment for them where they feel at home. I love the supper club. That's my generation. Newer generations expect a different kind of language in the spaces. And ultimately, all of that hospitality is not about food. Same way that the elements of our sacrament at altar, bread and wine is bread and wine. It's about the body and blood connected to it that provides that grace and salvation to us. Food service is not about food. It is about fellowship. It is about a person having the opportunity to provide hospitality to another person. It is engaging person to person. This church, this is a renovation. This was the church library prior to the renovation. The church had, next to their gathering space, a room that was 6 by 6. And that was the hospitality kitchenette, serving area. Barely big enough for 2 people, more comfortable with 1. There was a pass-through in the wall, a door that went up and down, and when it was up, there was a little hole like this. And when people came for coffee, there was an arm that came out with a coffee cup and gave them coffee. I love coffee, but it's not about the coffee. It is about seeing a person serving and a body engaging another body and using food as the opportunity to make that connection. Most churches have places for formal meal, and those provisions are also important. But generally, the place for meal, usually a church basement, is that the case here? I don't remember. The place for meal generally is not proximate enough to capture people connected to the worship. And so the gathering space, preparation of food, is just as important as the place for church dinner. And then, of course, there are other kinds of tables where we give people sustenance, whether that is meal service, food pantries, parish nursing program that helps give blood pressure readings to people before and after services. Every church has different ways of providing that sustenance. Many of those work best when they are somehow connected to the understanding that this is a part of what we do at worship. We are simply taking the gifts that sustain us in worship and extending them beyond our doors. And then air, inspiration, spirit, artistry, all of those things that make the worship connect with humans. The interesting thing about human beings is that we have physical form that responds to things that we see, things that we hear, things that we smell. There is nothing better than coming into a church and smelling a potluck going on. It changes how you approach the experience of being family in worship. And so using all of those senses, we usually rely on visual and hearing, but there's more than that. Traditional symbol of that proclamation of promise is the proclamation of the gospel in the reading, which we hear and need to hear. So sound systems become an important part of the worship experience. But we also have to think about newer technologies. Every church I have worked with over the last 30 years has struggled with how to incorporate new technologies into worship in a way that is sensitive to traditional symbol and does not get in the way. And that is incredibly difficult to do. It takes a lot of skill and care. This is actually a church that created a wainscot around their altar when this projection isn't present. It looks the same as these panels. So when the projection is off, it looks like a wainscot. When the projection is needed, it appears, and then it goes away. So it is not obtrusive at all to the architecture. Our chancels have to provide a way of incorporating a variety of different proclamation, whether that's a youth Sunday, whether that is a chancel drama. You actually get a good sense for that screen here. That's that screen when it's not in use. Providing for the flexibility of a chancel to be able to accommodate different means of proclamation on a Sunday becomes important, including the proclamation of worship. Most churches have a balcony where choirs are located, but occasionally there are other music, expressions of proclamation that need to be accommodated elsewhere in the worship. And it is difficult doing that in many of our churches. This is a picture of that church in Michigan. This is part of the reason they did that renovation. Musicians have a lot of stuff, and it is usually not pretty. They do pretty things with it, but chords and stands and monitors and instruments aren't necessarily what you want to see on a Sunday morning, and especially when it's not in use. That was the challenge that this church had, was what happens to all of this at their traditional service that doesn't use the praise musicians as a part of the worship. And it creates a further gulf between the fellowship and the proclamation on the chancel and the congregation. Technology also has a lot of stuff, and that also is not pretty. Most congregations figure out how to do this in a way that is sensitive to the worship experience. I was at this church for the first time this week and took a picture. They had a school, and so they had a chapel service. And this is what people encounter when they come to church and walk through the sanctuary doors. It's what they need to do. We're hoping the renovation provides a way of allowing that to be more discreet, so it is not the first thing that is encountered. Also at that church, this slide is so interesting. This is their praise band. The church itself is very dark. The symbols of the church, there is not a lot of contrast, so it's really hard to find the altar. And then with the screen, in order to be able to read the screen, they have to turn off more lights. And so the choir is dark. And the thing that stands out the most in the worship is the technology. It should not have to be that way. What we hope to do is allow technology and everything in the worship in the way of arts to continually point us back to word and sacrament. And if we plan it right, it can do that. Of course, there are a variety of different arts that have flourished through the years. Keith was telling me about a little bit of the history of your art class windows. The expression of the beauty in art tells the story of the church or inspires people before and after worship, or even outside of worship. So that church that burned in Ohio commissioned this piece of art as a proclamation into the community, expressing the joy that came out of the sorrow of the fire. A beautiful proclamation to the surrounding community because, of course, everybody knew that this church had burned down to the ground. Incorporating art is about conveying the message of the gospel and the history of the church. I have a fascination with doors because I actually think that threshold is a part of our church tradition. We don't often think about it that way. The first place I had the opportunity of expressing that is at a church in Davenport, Iowa. It's a Lutheran church, and the doors into the worship are 95 square feet, and they have 95 pegs into a cross embedded in the door that's the same as the cross at the end of the aisle behind their altar. part of the reason for that door is to create anticipation for people entering. We had to provide a lot of exit doors throughout the worship space, by code. But we wanted everyone to have that threshold experience of entering the church the same way. And so we created these huge doors, and they are closed, and when they are ceremonially opened, it is a phenomenal experience of welcome. And when they are opened at the end of worship, they are a symbol of sending back into the community to do the work of God in the world. Interestingly enough, the day that they dedicated the building was Reformation Sunday in 2008. I don't know if that's the right year. And the pastor did his children's sermon at the back of the church in front of these doors to tell the story of the Wittenberg Church and the 95 Theses. 15th century, doors were the current technology for posting advertisements and messages to the community. We do it a little different now. But it's nice being able to use artistic expression in the worship to embed meaning and history to the current church. Finally, I'll just leave you with this image. So again, this is that church that burned down and rebuilt, and they could rebuild however they wanted. And the very first thing that they said, after they said, we need to be a church of word and sacrament, was they wanted to create a church that used the full expression of the arts to convey the gospel promise. New organ, art glass windows. That fire window is actually out of picture here. They commissioned a tapestry that blew my mind. The committee came up with this on their own. But essentially, all of the liturgical colors of the church year are pieces of this tapestry behind their altar. So every Sunday of the church year and the color associated with that Sunday is represented in that tapestry. And then they add the colors of the current Sunday as the paraments that adorn the altar and ambo. Every decision that they made was about how to use the arts to convey the promise of God, so that the symbol of sustenance at the altar would have the environment to support it and reinforce that what we do is about tangibly connecting God to people. And we do that through our senses. In liturgical circles, we do not talk about decorating the church. Every once in a while, when I'm working with the building committee, I'll use the word decoration, and I always have to remind myself not to use that. We don't decorate the church. We create environment for word and sacrament. Because word and sacrament, while they are all that we need, they flourish in an environment that supports and proclaims them. And how we design our churches is about making that come to life for people that experience the world through senses. Air, fire, water, and earth. Those aren't the only things that we can use in worship, but they are expressions of fluidity and flow of spirit and gospel and the blood of Christ in our midst. So, do we need to take a break? Nope? Okay, let's keep going. So this is a second part where we are going to give you the opportunity to share what it is that you find challenging with your existing worship, what it is that is sacred to you, in other words, shouldn't be changed, or if it has to be changed, it ought to be changed very carefully. I often call them sacred cows. The things that we have to be really careful about because it's meaningful to the congregation, and what things you love and what things, you hope will provide a better expression of proclamation of word and sacrament here. So, we always have ground rules because Lutherans, you're so unruly. So, first ground rule, everyone gets to participate. If you want to participate, you get to participate. Mindful that unless we want to be here tomorrow morning, we have to do this in a way that moves us forward. Every comment will be recorded. Every comment is valid. No idea, no comment is a bad idea. It's what you think needs to be said, and that's okay. I think I'm too far away from this. We're not debating ideas. This is not about deciding what to do. This is about understanding how you all feel about this space and how well it ministers. Less is more. Again, we have to be concise because otherwise we won't get a chance to let everyone participate during the time frame. Don't be afraid to dream. The Christian church has always been at the forefront of vision for not only itself, but for much of what happens in society. The church is always about vision. So don't be afraid to dream and have fun, because what we're doing is not talking about renovating or renewing or building a building. We're talking about building the body of Christ and strengthening it. And that should be a blessing to us. So what we will do, here's our agenda. These are our topics. So invitation, talking about how people get into the building and through the building. So site, parking, and building entry. While we're talking about worship space, as I said earlier, these things are not disconnected. The liturgical experience begins outside of your building, and you can prepare people for the beauty of worship before they even enter. We'll talk about hospitality gathering, and that can include everything about hospitality gathering, access into the building, access through the building. Most churches are like hospitals. They have been added on to over time, and sometimes the path doesn't make sense because of that. The place of worship, I've left more time for place of worship because obviously we are talking about the place of worship, even though all these other things connect also with the place of worship. The arts in worship, so the artistic expression that happens in worship, whether that is music, whether that's environment, whether that is stained glass, whether that is symbol like cross or liturgical furnishings, parenting and how you provide for the needs of custodial care. Again, some of that's children, but some of that is just how convenient and accessible is your current worship for people that have difficulty navigating steps or have difficulty navigating aisles. And then the last section is really anything else. Anything else you want to say. Go Vikings. Whatever that is, it's a catch-all. So sometimes what happens is people don't think of something during the topic. We can come back to it, right? You got a place at the end to be able to do that. As I said, we're recording everything, so nothing is lost. And Keith, do we have a timekeeper? So the time's here. So 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, and 8 minutes. Somebody needs to remind me, or I will forget, because I will be too caught up in the conversation. So with that, great. So with that, you can wave, say time's up, throw a shoe, whatever works to get my attention. So we'll start with, now, Keith, do you need to say anything about how we're doing this with microphones or?
Jim, or were we going to have a handheld mic that we? Yeah. While we're getting that, could I have just a word?
Sure.
Yeah. I want to emphasize to everyone that this is Paul's first time to our congregation. He's spoken with a few of us, but the purpose of this is really get to know us. He talked about philosophical ideas, that's fair, is that a fair word? About what worship is. But please don't get the impression that he came here to say, this is what others are doing, you should do this.
Definitely.
That is not the purpose of this, to say, well, this is what this church did, therefore you should do this. No, he needs to get to know us. If he's going to work with us, he needs to get to know us as a congregation and what our mentality is. This is the time to help him, to inform him of what we are like as a congregation. Okay?
I'd like to reinforce that a little bit. My first job in church architecture was for a firm that had 95 years of history. And I could literally drive around on my travels to churches and point out their buildings. They had a 1950s type building that was the same for just about every church, a 1970s type building and a 1990s type building. The beauty of my job is that every congregation is unique. While we all have the same gospel, you have commonalities through your synod. Every church does things differently. What I have shown you is not to say that's what you have to do. It's to help you start to see there is great potential in renewing worship space to do different things and to do the same things. And part of this discussion is to say, let's not take out those things that work and have meaning for you, but where you have challenges, let's talk about them and figure out how to solve them. So, first section, invitation. Yes.
It's all right, let me get some steps in and run back to you. Because there are a number of people online, even though you can speak loudly, I want them to hear you. Thank you. You have, it's just for that. It's not meant to amplify in the sanctuary, it's for those people online.
Is this right?
Yeah.
Okay, you've talked a lot about different things, but I'd like to get us back. Phase 2, when we talked about remodeling, which we've done here, you should look around at beautiful bathrooms. But down in the kitchen, downstairs, it's inadequate and it certainly is not up to code. Our Sunday school rooms are limited and need expanding. The library is part of the lobby downstairs. I don't know how convenient that is to the librarian. And we have no green room for the choirs. The things that were planned in phase 2 is really great. Don't forget about those. Carpeting can be changed. This stuff on here can be, that's part of maintenance. I don't know if we're going to put in skylights here and do all kinds of stuff. And then you're a former pastor, so you're familiar with the Greek word, there we go, korexite. That's what brings people back. The word, preach the word. If you don't have the law and the gospel, the word and sacraments, doesn't matter how it looks. So look at phase 2. That's my thought.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Does everybody know what he means by phase 2?
I think I do, because you had a larger vision of other things that could happen beyond sanctuary, if I remember right.
First of all, I thought it was a great presentation. It opened up lots of minds, hopefully. And it's looking at the big, big picture, which I love. And all I want to mention is that the antiquated kitchen facilities need urgent attention. And they're found, and we need a fund to get established for the same as soon as possible. The basement fellowship hall is one of the entry points for non-member visitors to come to St. John's Church, especially after a funeral. And that's a great opportunity for friendship evangelism. And the kitchen laborers, both female and male, which we need more of, need a much more efficient, user-friendly environment for all willing servants and volunteers to come and pitch in and help.
Great. Thank you. Other things with invitation, how parking or building entry works.
Jim, I would say regarding parking, we do have the challenge of being landlocked, of course. With regard to parking, we have the challenge of being landlocked. When the service goes late, it's super hard to get the one group out before the next group comes in. You can be parked, a couple of blocks away. That's fine for me. I mean, you get used to it. But I can imagine for some that is a tremendous challenge, and especially if we do want to be a place that, welcomes others, the chances go down if they have to park a couple, 2-3 blocks away.
It's a challenge to, most churches wrestle with providing parking that's convenient for senior citizens that have difficulty navigating sometimes, for young parents who also have difficulty navigating with children, for visitors. It's a big challenge for visitors. I was lucky this morning. I found a nice spot on the corner because I drive a Prius, so it fit in a really tiny space that was left over. Visitors come back, right? Part of their experience of your congregation is how easy it is getting parked and into the building. And if they don't have commitments to your congregation and that's not a great experience, they may not return. Over here, yeah. Oh, over here. Either one.
Don't forget about updating the church sign.
So the signage is really important, right? Making sure that it is current, that it sends the message that you are a current church that is alive still. Every time I drive by churches that don't look like things have been updated on the outside, it makes me wonder if they are a dying congregation, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't you stay current? Yes?
So just a positive to the parking problem that we have is our drop-off. And that is a very nice place to drive through, drop off underneath so you're out of the weather. So that is an important part of this.
Great. Yeah, and that kind of canopy for people that take a little longer to get out of cars and get into the building. I know that Minnesota does not have any inclement weather at all. That's my recollection from being here in the state. But we have to think about that for people that have difficulty with icy path and snow and sleet and things like that. Yes?
We do appreciate that newer entrance on the parking lot side. There
There's a challenge to the entrance right behind us with those pretty steep stairs, very small and crammed, and we're expecting our friends to immediately dispose of their coats in a pretty small space. So that's an area I think for us to look at and see if we can make it better.
Great. It's interesting that churches often talk about how they can make the journey from parking to worship shorter. Not that that isn't a worthwhile conversation. My thinking is, because sometimes you can't change that, let's make it that journey meaningful. So if it's beautiful, if it's art-filled, if it provides proclamation and symbol to people on that journey can be meaningful and feel shorter, even if it can't be physically shortened. Yes?
Right. We love our new entrance, and it's well lit at night. It just looks beautiful when you drive by. That whole hallway with the arches is inviting and beautiful. But I think that we can light our main entrance at night and our sign to make the whole corner, the traditional front door entrance can look more inviting and beautiful at night.
Stone actually lends itself really well to warming in the right lighting. Yes. Oh, one back here. We'll come back.
Just one more to the entrance
One,
here.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have the entrance from the parking lot here into the sanctuary, and there's a lot of stages to it. When you come in, there's the open space where you can go to the left, and there's a church office, or up to the stairs. Then you get up the stairs, and then there's a stage where you can get rid of your coats or mingle a little bit, and then you get into the narthex and then into the sanctuary. And I wonder just about the flow and how inviting that can be and how it poses some challenges that way.
So a sequence of spaces that all have to kind of fit together as a part of the same entry experience from the parking. Yes?
I bet I don't need this. I noticed we have a place where we can bring wheelchairs or walkers there, and there's no sign, and there are people who do not need it that sit there, and then I noticed that walkers come in and they don't know where to go. So could we mark that somehow, that, and maybe even as it's going right now, we have a lot of them, and there's not enough room there for those.
It's one of the challenges that, churches from the 1950s through current expectations, even beyond 1994 when the Americans with Disability Act came into being, we are much more cognizant about how narrow pew width is to allow people with difficulty moving side to side. Churches are wrestling with providing as much flexibility as possible in their places of worship because everybody has different needs. And it's not to say that space isn't helpful, but it's not plentiful. And in fact, I think this morning you had a worshiper in a wheelchair in the front that was essentially in the aisle. And because that's where that person chose to want to be for worship. So trying to figure out how to provide for all those needs is often a challenge.
I think it's usually just for communion Sundays.
Oh, okay.
Access.
Sure. Yep.
That's 8 minutes.
Great. So hospitality, gathering, access, we've already kind of started on that path of wayfinding and talking about those things. Yes, right here. Pastor?
As a congregation with the MLC in town, we have a very unique opportunity, I think. Oftentimes, you see the kids coming and going, but talking with one of the parents recently, they expressed concern of the kids missing for 4 years that feeling of being in a congregation, and that was a concern for the parent. There's a lot of kids. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to accommodate 700 on a Sunday, but to make sure that they feel welcomed at Bible study. Right now, wonderfully, we fill the basement area with Bible study just with our own members. But how welcoming is that to an MLC student if you walk in and it's completely full? Or making sure maybe just that our offerings are Bible study based, maybe a little at times geared and oriented to them. So whether that means smaller, secluded Bible study or worship areas, or so that we're not just one big one, but I think facility could be addressing that as well a little bit.
Great. Yeah, I had to ask Keith if MLC had a chapel, or if, because I noticed a lot of people that age group here, and I made me wonder if MLC had chapel or if they encourage students to come to the local churches. Yes?
One thing I've noticed, and I'm a newer member, is it's been mentioned that there are several places between here and the parking lot, but it's all pass-through. And if you stand and talk, you either feel like you are in the way or you will be in the way because of, the rapid switches between services, et cetera. And there's no place upstairs to really pull off and fellowship and to meet people. You can, if you go to Bible study, number one, and then once you get down to the Bible study, and it's not very easy to find for a visitor because you have to go down 2 sets of stairs, and then you don't see it from the bottom of the stairs. And then when you go in, it's the setup, it works well for a Bible study, but it's set up more like a business seminar than a fellowship area. You get to meet the person that's maybe sitting next to you, but you don't get to meet a broad spectrum where like a circular table would give you more people to meet, things like that. So it's, in that way, it's a little harder to meet more people, and it's not a comfortable environment for doing that. If we had somewhere where we can kind of pull off that's adjacent to the sanctuary, where you can catch people who aren't going to be staying for Bible study and be able to sit down with them and get to know them a little bit.
It's interesting, there are formulas that architects use to figure out how big a gathering area ought to be. And I've been in a lot of churches where that rule applies to everything in the gathering. My approach is you have to remove all the circulation from that, because your observation is correct. People do not stay and feel comfortable staying in a place where they are in the middle of blocking the movement of people. So it's a challenging balance. You want people to stay and you want them to mingle, right? But you don't want navigation and circulation to push people out of the space. Yes?
This big room that's over here to me is a little, this big room over here, that's the coat room, it's a little bit of a wasted space, I feel, because I feel like you don't want to go over there to talk to people. But if we had something over there, like donuts, I would go over there.
You have to lure people where you want them to be.
You weren't here when we did the expansion. That was never supposed to be the end. Okay, so I mean, right, Earl, that's just, yeah.
Well, and again, how, I've learned this over the course of many years designing churches. What we intend in our designs and how people actually behave. I remember a story about, I want to say it was Mies van der Rohe. I can't remember the architect. But in designing a college campus, he'd said, we're not going to put in any sidewalks. And what they did was they put in the sidewalks after the children, the students created all the paths for the shortest distance between buildings. Really smart, right? Because you gotta respond to how people are actually going to behave. Was there another comment over? Yeah.
I was just going to make the same comment that Keith made. That was not the intention of this.
Yep. Well, and the other thing too that I've learned over time, I mean, I've been practicing long enough that I've had one of my buildings renovated. And you know, some people said, well, how do you feel about that? And I'm like, wonderful, because everything is done in its own time. And the needs of people change over time, and the behaviors of congregation change over time. So responding to all of that change is what we need to do generation to generation. Yes, another comment here.
One other, along with the invitation for fellowship, a lot of the congregations that we've visited more recently have had the big open area, easily accessible with the food, but with that, then standing tables, or so people have a place to put their coffee, they have a place to put their donut. People tend to stand around. If a table is in your home, think about your table. You have the nice couches, but where do people tend to congregate? In the kitchen with the food. That's where the conversations happen. And having those tall standing, or having stools for some, but just having the tall tables, I think, encourages that as well.
I often tell my congregations the most deadly thing you can do to a fellowship space is put in comfortable furniture like couches. And they often say, well, we're doing that because we want the visitors to be comfortable. And I'm like, no visitor is going to sit in a couch in a church that they don't know, right? They understand they may be taking somebody's comfortable spot. What we have to do with gathering space is exactly what you're describing. High tops, movable, flexible seating, easily flexible, and less seating than standing room, because we want people to interact. If we give people a place to sit down and stay put, they don't welcome visitors. They don't move around and create community. Good point. Yes?
Hi.
Great.
I'm a little bit newer to this current congregation. I come from up in Lakeville area. And I just want to make sure that everyone, this is kind of a two-part thing. Number one, I'm a little unfamiliar with the phase 2. I don't know when that is going to happen, or even possibly going to happen, but I guess I was kind of with the first person that commented. If that is still an option that we're going to do as phase 2, then wouldn't we be better off just doing that and then incorporating all of what we're talking about now and that all at one time? And in the long run, that's going to cost a lot less and get more of what we want right away, incorporating the whole thing. In addition to that, I did come from a previous church that had the luxury of building an all brand new church up in Lakeville, North Cross. And it incorporated all those things you were talking about. It's a big, wide open space. It's very easy flowing for people. There's lots of places for people to stand and congregate for fellowship afterwards. You know, we already have the word here, which is first and foremost, but we can incorporate technology and everything else to further attracting new people that haven't come. So we can't forget about that. We're here. We're always going to be here, but the new people, they don't see it that way. So we have to make sure that we have the new technology going forward with the new kids in college and whatnot. So.
Great, thank you.
Just a comment. I do want to remind, we are the Congregational Facilities Task Force. We are not the Church Sanctuary Renovation Committee. We started with this idea. We didn't know where to start. It seemed to be one of the things on the poll. But when all is said and done, I mean, we as a congregation may decide this phase 2 has to be our first priority. Okay, but I just wanted to make that clear, that we're not just, we don't have blinders on about this space right here. We were commissioned to look at the facilities of the congregation and what we need. And Paul knows that too, right? I mean, yeah, he's, okay. I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, so place of worship, and I remind you, we have a section where we can talk about music and art and technology, and we have a place where we can talk about parenting, whether that's in worship or out of worship. So this space, what works, what doesn't work, what are the challenges, what do you love, what things maybe don't work so well. Yes, we'll get a microphone over to you.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're also streaming this, so the
Right.
microphone is helpful.
I was on a committee early on to look at the acoustics in this part of the facility, and the louvers we have up front are something that have to go because they are sound sucks instead of sound enhancing, and that is something that we have to look at. But we've also looked at how we can get technology in here, and you've said that's very difficult, and we totally agree with that. We have not, this is our compromise, and it's been working for some time, but those are kinds of things that we've been thinking about in the past, so.
It's a challenge in older churches, and especially in sacramental denominations like yours, because you don't want to be the church of the screen, right? You want to be the church of word and sacrament, and the screen is technology no different than lights are technology. You're not worshiping lights. Lights help you worship God and the sacrifice of his son.
I don't see anyone's hand, so I'll speak up. As one of the pastors, I'm thankful that the kneelers have kind of gone away. I think we could get rid of the transformer kneelers now. We have a congregation that is overwhelmingly blessed with musical talent. We have a lot of the music profs here in our congregation. I think if we had made more space up front, there's talk of a baby grand up here. Handbell choir that we just started would need a place to play, and it's kind of cramped up there. So I think maybe take out another pew or two up front would be helpful. Also for the school kids do their Christmas program. They're pretty packed up there when we get 100 kids up in that space. So
it's one of the challenges in the long, narrow church is the breadth of the chancel is only so wide, right? And I've seen churches where the music programming, when it starts to move either in front of the chancel or on the chancel, starts to overtake the sacred symbols of theology, and that's the hard, decisions in design that we have to wrestle with.
get my stuff. There you go.
Yeah, I do not find this personally challenging, but I know some struggle with the sight lines. You sit in the pews and then you're trying to see the preacher or just follow the liturgist. So if there would be a way of elevating the area in front.
It's really interesting because I think I was sitting probably right where this beam is this morning. That's my first worship with you. And I could see fine until everybody stood. And I'm not a short, I'm a normal kind of height for a male. And I had difficulty then seeing what was happening in the front. Yes, way in the back.
I think we need better lighting. Our lights, these are rather dim and old, and look at the cross. I mean, it should have better lighting, I think, behind it. And we need more spotlights. Like we could have a spotlight on the hymn numbers so you can see them better, on the banner, because some services we turn the lights all down and we just leave like a light on the banner, and it's just, I'm one of the banner artists, so I have to put a little IKEA light there and try to aim it at that thing, and it gets just at the bottom. I mean, it's really poor. I think we need better lighting in here.
And the technologies for lighting have changed so phenomenally, even in the last 5 years, of what can be done with lighting that we previously couldn't do.
I'll just say you'll be happy to hear that the cross light is being fixed on Tuesday. The electrician finally got it was a supply line thing that didn't come. Yeah, I think so. I'm not the moderator.
How many here now know where the mother's room is? I think everybody should know, but it's not that visible because it's halfway down the steps or the second steps. A room back here, if we remove a couple pews and have one-way windows, so the mother or father, whoever, will feel like they are still worshiping.
That's always a challenge of how we keep parents connected to worship when they have children that maybe sometimes need to either be on the periphery or need to be trained in a more controlled environment for how to worship.
I don't know if I'm going to be run out of this place after I say this, but we have a lot of great ideas. We were talking about a mother's room maybe placed in back of the glass area in the narthex. We're talking about flow of movement, inviting guests, all these things. We're talking about taking pews out for more room for musicians. Easter Sunday and Christmas are really interesting in the balcony with all the musicians up there. You really have to shimmy around to move. I'm wondering if we're just outgrown this place. That's why I'm afraid all of you are. But I came from a church and school where it's been added onto 5 times. And it was like a split-level home. And there were stairs everywhere. The idea of making it ADA compliant was almost impossible. And my first impression coming 5 years ago or so was, my goodness, there's a lot of stairs. And we're really bursting at the seams here. If we want to angle pews and create more room so people can walk up to communion more easily, we're removing seating. We want to add a mother's room. I agree with all these ideas. But I'm wondering if we're trying to put a big Band-Aid on something that really essentially doesn't work. So I said my piece, and thank you for not throwing hymnals at me, even though we have new ones coming.
Thank you for saying that. Again, this is my first experience in the building, and I've seen, video of the building, so I have no idea, where this will go. But that's exactly why we do a visioning like this, is to air ideas and talk about what the needs are. There are churches that we have renovated that had to compromise because of the limitations of the building. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just the reality. You can only do so much with something. But I also know that not every church is ready to, completely redo how they do worship or to build bigger space. But it's a part of the conversation. Yes.
John mentioned before removing the louvers. I wondered, could we go even further and just take out these walls no, I mean, I understand there's some work that goes on there. Could that be handled in a different way?
Sure. Great, good comment.
Where would I change?
There's a question back here.
I agree with former statements. One thing that should be considered is we are an aging congregation also, although we do have many young people. But one thing that should be considered is availability of an elevator access to everywhere, not just the basement and the entryway, but also to the balcony if we have musicians who are handicapped, etc.
Well, the codes have requirements about when you do a certain amount of renovation or when you build new. There are only a certain amount of areas that are allowed to be inaccessible. Anything you touch. So I had a project where we couldn't touch the balcony because it would have triggered code requirements to put in an elevator. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do that. Part of the reason isn't to fulfill code. It is because how you deal with the people that have the most challenges in your midst with navigating says something about your commitment to care and equity for all people. Doesn't mean you have to do everything under the sun, right? But it does mean my home church chose to not put an elevator into the building to the ground level. They put it to the balcony, the main level, and the basement, but they didn't connect it to ground because the people in wheelchairs could go around the building, through the back of the building, through where the garbage is collected, and get into the building. And it was a mistake. And because it didn't deal with upholding the dignity of all people. And they saved like $20,000 to do that. And the project I worked on with them 20 years later was to provide that access, and they spent a lot more than $20,000 to provide the access then to that elevator.
So we have to remember our unique situation here with the college students. We could do a lot of adjusting of the pews, whatever, if that wasn't a factor. I mean, we'd have plenty of room to do that, but we, 9 months out of the year, we're full. But then there's 3 months out of the year that we really don't, so we got to keep that in mind.
The rule of thumb for church designers is at 80% capacity on a regular basis. At 80% capacity, visitors tend to not come back because they don't feel that there's room for them. Similarly, there is a 50% rule that if you regularly have 50% of your worship space empty, and I don't mean just like during the summer or once in a while, that then the reverse is true, that people think you're a dying congregation. So there's this balance of 50 to 80 that is the target, and if you surpass it in either direction, you have to figure out how to make that work and feel still generous on the one hand, but not overly generous on the other. Yes?
I'm a little biased because I have a lot of worship experiences up on the hill in the Chapel of the Christ. And we do appreciate the clear windows in that space and the light it brings in. And that's something that we could think about for this space as well.
I'm always amazed. I designed an entire church to take existing stained glass and put it in a new building. But they did not have the resources to move the glass. And I said to the building committee, I don't believe you'll ever move it. It wasn't really overly beautiful glass. They got so used to having the natural light that when they had the resource to move the glass, they decided they didn't want to do it because they would miss the natural light in their space. I always think it's a balance, and a lot of spaces we design for both natural light and art glass combined, mixed. Anything else? Yes.
I've listened to a lot of the ideas, and I am fine with a lot of them. And with up front, I will admit that I'm kind of a wood guy, so I like the wood ceiling. However, with the louvers or things up front, we've talked about lighting and so forth. If the wood disappeared up front and put drywall a little bit brighter, that might give the impression right away, and focus a little bit on the altar and the items there too. So guess consider that as well, and how far you want to go with that up front, or cover up the cinder block or whatever. But that might help with the impression of lighting and space up front as well.
Great, thank you. So, the arts in worship. So, how you deal with things like music, technology, visual arts, liturgical arts.
I've been missing texts. Did anyone mention the darkly lit low ceiling of the old narthex? Back there.
Yep. Which is, I mean, this is the challenge with balconies. It's not only that the balconies themselves present challenges, they present challenges for spaces under the balconies as well. Particularly when they're in worship. When you've got worship seating that's actually under a balcony, it's really a challenging acoustic environment in a worship space.
I don't recall if the question has been asked. It would be interesting to hear thoughts as we go about a renovation of some sort. I mean, is there a desire, is it the plan that screens would be incorporated somewhere? Is that a question that's been asked, a topic that's been discussed or not?
I mean, I'm new to this process, so I can't really answer that question, but I can tell you whether they are always present, sometimes present, carefully hidden. I have yet in the last 10 years to design a brand new worship space or a renovation that didn't think about how screen technology could be incorporated. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's telescopes from behind an area so it's not visible when you don't want it. But if you're not thinking about it, even if you don't implement it, you're leaving something out of the plate that in 20 years is going to be commonplace pretty much in every worship experience. It already is almost to that point, and even in the more higher church sacramental denominations, so Episcopals, Wells Lutherans, Missouri Synod Lutherans, not so much the LCA, but the churches that have really high expectations for word and sacrament are still doing projection. It's just, it's the current place of the technology and how we deal with, and COVID has actually increased that and the need for technology. We kind of have learned sometimes the only option is to attend online, and if that's not an option, you lose people if they can't come to church.
Just going to say with the screens and projection, I'm a hymnal and hands guy. I like looking at the music and mentally playing it, that kind of thing. But being in other churches, I can see where, going to the next subject, parenting, that's just such a vital thing. To expect a mom or a dad juggling 2 kids and now a hymnal, good luck. And then even another church too I was in, for communion, as I'm standing in line, I can see the hymn, I can sing that while I'm waiting there too. So the flow of worship is not disrupted.
And there's a certain expectation and functionality to it. The challenge, I always think, with technology, and I've been in churches, that they spent a good deal of money on technology and then overuse it because they've spent so much on it. You have to think about when you put it in, do it right, but also discern where it's useful and where it isn't. And don't run into the temptation of just expecting, because you've spent a lot of money and a lot of design on it, that it's going to be used all the way through worship. It doesn't work very well that way. Yes?
I think when we think about our arts and worship and music, the acoustic in here is very dry. And I know that was done so that the spoken word could be clearly heard, and I'm not disputing that needs to be the case. But I think the acoustic needs to be enhanced. A part of it, too, is just to see ourselves as a community of worshipers. If you have a sparse attendance, let's say we're in summer and we have one of those services that isn't as well attended, you will hear other people. I don't know what, oh, there we go. You hear other people singing along with you and participating in the service, which gets a little lost in a space like this where you can sing and speak and your voice falls on your lap, so to speak. It would also enhance the music of the instruments that we use in the choir, thinking of the Word of God that's being sung, if the acoustic was better in here.
The interesting part about it is that music and congregational singing requires an environment to support that singing. We have technology now that can correct for spoken word in a lively acoustic. And that's one of the gifts of technology that can bring us, but you can't create a good acoustic for music except through the building. Unless you want to mic every person in worship, right? We don't want to do that. The natural acoustic of the worship space promotes congregational singing, and Lutherans are hymn singers. So we need that. Yes?
For full disclosure, I am on the committee, and I believe the committee was trying to allow all of you to offer your ideas without throwing things at you or burdening you with things that we've already talked about. As the acoustic thing comes up, I'm reminded of one of the, not my ideas, in our old study, I think they're 16 years old, Acoustic Studies. We have had studies on screens. They've been talking about maybe needing them up front and midway. It introduces all kinds of crazy challenges for trying to conceal them when you want to conceal them. But the acoustic one, somebody had the idea, mentioned at one of our meetings, that the wood in here has been, I guess, it needs to be finished or refinished or something, but one of the fixes might be sleepers between the beams and sheetrock. Imagine in here with a sheetrock ceiling between the beams. It would reflect more light, bring more light in. Another one that was mentioned, maybe tongue-in-cheek, but I kind of like the idea, was the possibility of perhaps cupola type sheds, maybe over the, maybe skip. It would bring in light, and you have to be careful that you control it, because sun can be a problem there. But these are things that the committee's talked about, and I didn't want to bring them up too soon, but I'm looking forward to looking into some of those ideas a little bit further. Don't know if you have any reaction to that.
Well, so the only reaction I have is I have seen one acoustic study. It may have been the last one. Scott Rydell. Yeah. I work with Scott all the time. Building acoustics doesn't really change too much. The technology issues, though, I mean, that's a moving target, right? Because right now, LED screen is more useful and more cost-effective in worship than projection. It wasn't that way for a long time, but now that's the case, and it is less sensitive to light. So part of what we have to do is always discern where's the technology, what's the right application, and when does the technology enhance and when does it get in the way. And that's a difficult balance for a lot of sacramental worshiping communities. Oh, okay. So let's do this. Anything else with art and technology? Why don't we do this? Why don't we just agree to have one last section that can involve parenting, can involve anything else. And so anything that either you didn't get a chance to say or that you think needs to be said.
I heard a lot of comments about I couldn't find the Bible class, or it was difficult to find a Bible class. It's difficult to find the mother's room. I think a lot of those issues can be solved with something simple, like more signage around our church. It's not that costly, and it could alleviate a lot of those problems right now.
Great. So signage might be an opportunity to really facilitate wayfinding.
Should wear different shoes today.
As far as parenting goes, I've noticed that there are a number of young families with young children, my family being one of them, but we're one among many. And some of the families are very big, which is, all of this is a very big blessing, and we really enjoy fellowshipping with other families, fellowshipping with our fellow congregation members. After service, ahead of Bible study, we're all downstairs in the basement, and there's no real place for the children to go or things to occupy them, and they find themselves moving among, the rest of us, which isn't always conducive for good fellowshipping among safety, fellowshipping among, the congregation. And so just considerations for how we can engage the young ones during that time too, and with those spaces.
Good, thank you. Attending to children is never easy, but it does give parents an opportunity to be able to then focus on renewing their resources and renewing their faith in education as well.
Must have all been said already.
No. So, without further comment, let me just thank you. This was a beautiful weekend to be back in Minnesota. So thank you for that. And thank you for a wonderful worship experience. It was kind of interesting. I grew up in the ALC way back. But parts of your liturgy are from the old hymn book that I grew up with. And it kind of brought passion to my chest to be singing some of the stuff I used to sing as a kid and haven't for some time. So thank you for attending. Thank you for your input and fellowship during this time. Keith's committee will discern how best to move forward. I will be collecting information and kind of ordering it for the things that said, things that relate to each other, kind of categorizing those, and then turning that back over to Keith. But thank you for today. And however you move forward as a congregation of word and sacrament, many blessings in what you do, because you're providing for this area vital ministry and opportunity for worship. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you for attending and for your questions and your input. It is valued. I want you to know that it is valued. Like I said, we are just at the beginning of whatever and wherever. That we're just at the beginning. But it is something we need to do as a congregation, because in the end, this is St. John's. This is our congregation. And to be united as brothers and sisters in Christ, so important, so important. Thank you, Paul, for your presentation, which was intended to just do one thing, get us thinking about these things, just to get us thinking. I ask for your prayers for our committee as we take this information and as we move forward. We look for communication from you. We'll be regularly communicating with the church council and the newsletter. Please, if you didn't get a chance to say something or wanted to say and didn't really want, but really didn't want to say it, please feel free to approach any of the members of our committee or the pastors and just talk about these things. Okay, it's so important that we talk about these things. We probably won't agree on everything with things like this. It does happen, but it does not need to be a divisive thing among us. Now, I'd like to close with a prayer, and then I'll take the prerogative of saying we can join in saying the common table prayer and the closing prayer, and then we can do what Lutherans really do well, and that's go down and enjoy a potluck. as brothers and sisters, right? Okay, we close. Thank you, Lord, for this day of grace, the beautiful weather, and the double blessing of you bringing us into your house to worship you for all your goodness to us. We thank you for this meeting, and we pray that as we move forward timidly into what is right now a very unclear future, but you have promised to go with us and guide us, to never leave us or forsake us. You gather us around your word and sacrament and remind us that you are with us to the very end of the age. And now, Lord, as we enjoy the food that you've prepared for us, we thank you. We join. Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, and let these gifts to us be blessed. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Amen. Thank you.